Hi, and welcome to part 2 on this webinar series on photogrammetry basics. In this series, we are going to go through the DJI Go 4 app and do the basic drone settings, as well as we're going to go into Ground Station Pro and go into some basic settings for waypoint planning and what one should think about, and then finally, ground control points. When you've started up your drone, the controller, and open up the DJI Go 4 app, this is the first screen that you will see. It's always a good idea to check that you've got the latest firmware on your drone. Your flight mode should be on GPS. Your maximum flight altitude should be set to the maximum legal allowed limit for your country. The compass should be fine. The IMU should be working. And your electronic speed controller should be fine. Your visual sensors should be working. Flight mode is optional. In our case, we fly with flight mode 2. You should check that you've got enough battery power on your controller and that you should have enough battery power in the drone for the required flight. Most of the time, the auto setting on your camera settings will work just fine. When you press the camera settings tab, you'll get a pop-up menu where you can choose the auto setting. This is for aperture priority setting, shutter priority setting, or full manual setting. In auto setting, it will automatically choose the ISO, the shutter speed, and the f-stop. The next you should check is the exposure value and image size. Your exposure value should always be a bit underexposed. I like to fly with minus 0.7, but you can choose minus 0.3 as well. The image size is very important, and that should be at 4.3. The rest of the settings you should look at are the following. You should unlock the gimbal when you capture photographs, because this can cause motion blur. You should turn off the focus assistant, because this can also cause motion blur or unsharp pictures where the camera can focus on objects not on the ground. The mechanical shutter should always be turned on, because this can cause the banana effect in SkyMap. The rest of the settings are preferential. There are many different mapping applications like Drone Deploy, Map Pilot, UGCS, and in this case we will look at DJI's own Ground Station Pro app. When GSP is launched, you get an option of various different types of missions you want to fly. In this case, we will just concentrate on a 3D map area. It's always a good idea to check the Fallsafe settings. In my case, I've set the Fallsafe to return to home in case of the drone signal loss. I also check that my return to home altitude is at least at the flight height or even a bit higher. This can change if there are obstacles in the way like cranes or high buildings, so you should always have your drone fly back higher than the obstructions. And once again, the max flight altitude for Sweden is 120 meters. This may vary from region to region or in what country you are. Once your drone is started up and has acquired a GPS fix, you should always check that you're actually in the right area to do the mission. Once you've established that, you can press the plus button to start your new mission. The first step to do is to take the grab handles and drag them out to cover the actual area that you want to map. It's always a good idea to drag the grab handles out to cover an area slightly larger than what you actually want to map. When we go into the basic settings, We can have the shooting angle at course aligned. We capture an equal time interval of 2 seconds, which means that the camera will take a picture every other second. The software will then automatically calculate the speed. And then the height we can set at our desired flight altitude. In the advanced settings, we should always make sure that we have at least 80% forward overlap and 80% side overlap. Our course angle can be set by this slider, and this is just the orientation of the flight lines to make the drone fly as economically as possible. And then we can have the gimbal pitch angle at always minus 90 degrees for orthomosaic mapping, and if you do 3D buildings, you should adjust the gimbal angle to optimize the facades of the building. And at the end of the mission, return to home. When images are not sharp, or underexposed, or even overexposed, due to the auto settings of the camera not working for the conditions, it might be strong wind, low light conditions, or very sunny conditions over a very light area that you're going to fly over. You can always go back to the camera settings and then force it in the manual settings, where you can fix the ISO to what you need. You can also manipulate the aperture and the shutter speeds to get sharp pictures. When you are flying manually, without the aid of a mapping app, you can do so by going into the photo settings, scroll down to timed shot, and then choose the interval. In my case, I've chosen 2-second interval, and this would negate the need for me to press the shutter every single time I want to take a photograph. By pressing the shutter once, now the drone will take a picture every other second. Lithium polymer batteries do not work well in cold weather. You should always try and keep the batteries warm. You should also have a backup tablet or phone in cold weather because their batteries don't last long either. When flying manually, keep the speed under 3 meters per second at 40 meters height and under 5 meters per second at 50 meters height. In strong wind, have a fast shutter speed and a high ISO. Ground control points, or so-called GCPs, are a very important and integral part of drone-based photogrammetry. They should always be measured in with at least a survey-grade RTK GPS or a total station. There are many different types of targets. These targets, for example, can be nailed into the ground through these eyelets. They have a very good contrast between the black and the white, and they're quite visible from the sky. The downside is that they need to be nailed into the ground, and afterwards they need to be picked up again. White paint works best in most cases. It's got a good contrast to the background. A can of paint is easy to carry. There's no need to pick it up afterwards, so you don't have to walk through the site twice. The downside is paint doesn't last forever, and one might not be allowed to paint in certain areas. Mark your GCPs well. Make sure that it is numbered correctly and that the number corresponds to the right file in your total station or GPS. The number should be clearly visible in the photographs. You should be able to see the GCPs without zooming in. This is an example of badly marked GCPs. There are 2 GCPs in this photo. One cannot see them well. If we take a look at this GCP in the next slide, one can see why contrast is important. In this case, because of the sharp sunlight, the light concrete, and the yellow paint that the GCP is marked with, the GCP is almost invisible. It would have been better to paint the cross over here with the number. Think about the placement of your GCPs. Where are they? In this photograph, there are two GCPs. There is one GCP in this area here, and there is one GCP underneath the car. It's very difficult to look for GCPs when they are underneath cars or trees. This is the GCP from the previous slide that's lying underneath the tree. This makes it very time consuming to look for GCPs, and on a job with 400 or 500 photographs, this can waste a lot of time. You also have to think about how long you're going to use the GCP in a certain site. In this case, this GCP over here was used several times during the project. But during the course of the time, due to machines driving over the GCP, humans walking over it, and the GCP being on gravel, it deteriorated over time. With the placements of GCPs on site, there are a few things to think about. The absolute minimum amount of GCPs required are 5 for up to 5 hectares. Thereafter, 1 GCP per hectare extra for each hectare more than 5. You should have at least 1 GCP at each corner and 1 in the middle. Put extra GCPs at the lowest as well as the highest points where possible. On long narrow areas like roads, it's very important to have parallel GCPs on either side of the road or the narrow area that you're going to map. And the pairs of GCPs should not be further apart than 100 meters on flat and straight areas, and not further apart than 50 meters in the curves or undulating terrain. Try to play the GCPs where they will not be worn away or disturbed. Placing them in a parking space or underneath a tree is a bad idea. Remember, one can never have too many GCPs. For SkyMap, you are going to need a text file tab separated, and it should look like this. First, you should have your GCP number that corresponds with your target or the cross that you've painted on the ground when you measured in your GCPs. The next, you'll have a northing coordinate, easting coordinate, and your height. In most cases, when models fail by being not in the right place or at the wrong height, it is due to the coordinate system not being set up properly. It is very important to measure in your GCPs in the right coordinate system and adjust your software, like SkyMap, to the right coordinate system for the project. And do not forget the geoid models. This brings us to the end of this webinar series on photogrammetry basics. I thank you for your time and good luck.